2. Dressed in a clean green overall, with her hair brushed to a flame, and singing snatches of a hymn tune alternately with snatches of the latest musical comedy, Sally moved about her shining kitchen preparing her breakfast. The spring sun glinting on the fittings of her electric stove, lighting up the scarlet geraniums on the windowsill, made her utterly happy. The smell of the coffee made her feel happy too, and the smell of toast. She laid her breakfast tray daintily and sat down to the kitchen table to eat and to review the coming day. After breakfast, Mrs. Baker would come, and they would start the housework, and then while Mrs. Baker was having her elevenses, she would go to the greengrocer's, and perhaps she would meet the 5 children there and talk to them. They were usually there about 11 in the holidays, buying lettuce for their mother, and sometimes they brought their mother's Pekingese with them. She loved those children, and she loved their Pekingese, and she wished they were hers. And then she would come back and finish the housework, have lunch, go for a walk by the river, and watch the sun on the water and hear the seagulls crying. After that she would come home and have a read, put on her new frock, and go to Jan Carruthers' cocktail party. That would be fun. Parties were always fun. Then she would come home and bake some cakes, and after supper she would listen to the wireless and go on with the sweater she was knitting for her father, and then go upstairs and help Mrs. Rutherford with her patchwork quilt for a while and say good night to her. She hoped that not too many people would come in to see her thinking she was lonely. She was never lonely. The morning worked out according to plan. Leaving Mrs. Baker to wield the broom in the rest of the flat, Sally tackled her father's studio. Their Chelsea flat was a lovely, luxurious place, the home of a rich and famous man who loved beauty. To Sally's mind it was a bit too full of things, but then it was not John Adair who had given to Sally her love for order, simplicity and space. Providing everything he ate out of, trod on or sat on was a thing of beauty, he did not mind how jumbled up everything was. His studio was so jumbled up that Mrs. Baker, when first required by him to clean it up a bit, but not on any account to move anything, had been taken with the palpitations and had gone home. So now Sally dealt with it. It took her a good 2 hours, but clumsy though she was, she had never yet smashed anything, and had never yet failed to restore everything she moved to the exact place where it had been before. She passed through the studio like light, making new, without commotion, her long fingers touching bottles and tubes, canvases, palettes and rags, with the reverence of a sacristan at work in a holy place. She did indeed reverence her father's art. Fame and the perfecting of his technique had not dimmed his discernment. In every beautiful woman, in every famous man who came to him, he could still see and portray what Sally called the patient angel. For a long time she had been at a loss as to how to describe the invisible presence that in some miraculous way her father's genius could present to one's consciousness as one's eyes looked upon the visible form. Then one day she had found a battered old volume of sonnets from the Portuguese, fallen down behind a bookshelf, opened it at random, and found the words she wanted leaping up at her from the page. Because thou hast the power and ownest the grace to look through and behind this mask of me, against which years have beat thus blanchingly with their reins, and behold my soul's true face, the dim and weary witness of life's race, because thou hast the faith and love to see, through that same soul's distracting lethargy, the patient angel waiting for a place in the new heavens. Angel seemed the right word, yet now and then, very occasionally, Sally had seen something in a portrait that had made her turn cold with horror. It was as though the angel had 2 faces, and only one of them light. She never questioned her father about his work. Aware of her abysmal ignorance, she was afraid to hurt him by clumsy misunderstanding. But she thought she knew how it was that consciously or unconsciously he came to see the patient angel. He was not content merely to observe his sitters in the studio. Whenever he could, he strolled unobtrusively into their lives and watched them, entertaining, being entertained, working, eating, reading, perhaps even sleeping. They were for the most part unaware of his scrutiny, for his entrances and exits were very cleverly contrived. There was a big portfolio in the studio full of lightning sketches that he had made, sometimes upon a scrap of paper, sometimes upon the back of a menu or a concert programme, sometimes of the men and women whose portraits he was painting, but often just of some stranger's face that had caught his fancy. They were so nakedly revealing that the first time she had opened the portfolio, Sally had immediately shut it again, as one shuts the door of a private room, opened inadvertently. Then, longing to look again, she had gone to her father and asked his permission. "Certainly," he had replied, his clever, ugly face creased with delight at the honesty of this young daughter of his. "There's nothing in the studio that you may not examine to your heart's content, provided you leave everything exactly as it was before." And so now, when she had finished cleaning the studio, she always rewarded herself by setting down with the portfolio and looking for the latest sketches. There were quite a batch of them today, and she chuckled with delight at the audacity and insight of their hasty scribbles. But there was one that was not so hasty, and at sight of it Sally had the oddest feeling, as though someone had given her a violent shove in the back, so that the world turned upside down for a moment. It was larger than usual and had obviously been drawn at leisure. At the bottom of the sheet of paper, John Adair had scribbled D.E. at rehearsal. Evidently he had sat unobserved in the auditorium of a theatre or concert hall and drawn the man as he worked upon the stage. Sally put the other sketches back in the portfolio, and taking just this one, went to the window seat and sat down there, laying it on her lap and studying it intently. She had never seen this face before, she was quite certain, and yet she knew it, and would always know it. If she were to meet this man 20 years hence in the street, she would know him. It was ridiculous, but it was true. The sketch had been faintly coloured, probably from memory, when John Adair had been in his studio again, and gave to this man smooth, pale gold hair, blue eyes, a fine tanned skin, a finely shaped head, and perfect features. John Adair, to whom conventional beauty was an exasperation, had conceded this much grudgingly, as though he regretted it, and then had drawn with vigour and pleasure all that was individual in the face, the hard bones showing almost savagely through the taut skin, the hollowed temples, the dark stains beneath the eyes, with their curious look of vacancy, contrasting so oddly with the keenness of the rest of the face, the obstinate line of the jaw, the suggestion of bitterness about the mouth, with its line of endurance. It was a young face, with the youth of it crossed out, as it were, by the lines slashed mercilessly by John Adair's pencil across the broad, low forehead, and from the nose to the bitter mouth, and the beauty of it marred by the stains beneath the eyes and the tautness of the skin. The head stood out in startling fairness against a strange background, the background of a wood, with the shapes of queer beasts and birds just discernible amongst the trees. It was like the landscape of a dream, and it had the vagueness of a dream that is half forgotten upon waking. At first Sally had scarcely noticed this background, but when she did notice it, she looked at it long and attentively, with an odd feeling of familiarity. Then she looked again at the portrait, and a sudden rage took possession of her. She was sure her father had not been fair. He must dislike the man, for he had cruelly accentuated the obstinacy, the bitterness, how was she to put it, the threadbare look of the face. And then looking again, she was not so sure about the cruelty. This was not only a portrait of D.E., whoever he might be, it was a portrait of many men whom she knew. That was how countless men had gone through the war, men of thought and sensitiveness, to whom the whole damn law business was almost unendurable. With just that almost savage obstinacy that a little dog shows when he is getting the worst of it in a senseless dog-fight, but means to hold on till the end. Men so tired that their eyes looked at you as though they were sleepwalkers, who did not see you at all. Men who were bitter and sick of heart, because now that the thing was over, it did not seem to have accomplished much. So there was a patient angel waiting, not only behind each person, but behind each type of person, thought Sally. And so behind each of us 2 angels, and the beating of the years hammered out the future, not only of oneself, but of something more than oneself. You suffered not only for yourself, but for all the people who shared your kind of temperament, and your courage redeemed them, as their courage redeemed you. And perhaps old houses had their angel, created through the years by the people who lived there, and nations, and— "Fool," said Sally suddenly and ferociously to herself, and flushed scarlet to the roots of her copper-coloured hair. It was wonderful what highfalutin theories about suffering one could formulate when one did not happen to be suffering oneself. Far away in the flat, miles away it sounded, the door of the cupboard where the Hoover was kept was slammed meaningly, and even the kitchen door slammed. Mrs. Baker's elevenses were long overdue. Without looking at it again, Sally put the drawing back in the portfolio, and the portfolio in its accustomed place, and returned to her duties.